Hey, welcome to the Tales of a Gearhead podcast. I'm your host, Stacey David. This podcast is brought to you by LMC Truck. Keep them on the road is their slogan, and they supply the parts to help you do that. Also, Cornwell Tools, the choice of professionals and hot rods and enthusiasts alike. If you want quality tools, Cornwell's the place to go. Let's get to it. A couple weeks ago, went into level 1 and level 2 of building a project. These are all based on a series that we're doing on Amazon Prime called Stacey David's Restoration Series. Check that out if you guys are into restoration stuff at all. Hopefully we'll answer some questions and encourage you to get out there and build and work on stuff with your own two hands. Like I said, the first two that we dealt with, level 1, which is getting the project running and drive it. The second level is a cosmetic and mechanical restoration. And the third level is what we're talking about today, the Restomod. Yeah, that's where a lot of people want to be. That's the project that most people want. And a Restomod can be inexpensive or it can end up getting pretty expensive. And there's a lot of ways you can get lost in a Restomod, so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this. First of all, what the heck is a Restomod? What does it mean, Restomod? Well, just like the name implies, it's part restoration and it's part modification. And of course, people will argue that left and right exactly what that is, but generally that's what we're talking about when we're talking about a Restomod. So a great example of that is a guy that has like a 68 Chevelle and he loves the shape of it, but he wants to put modern suspension, engine, air conditioning, that kind of stuff into it. So he wants the original look of the car, but he wants to do a bunch of modern stuff to it. A level 3 Restomod is not a frame off. That's level 4. We'll deal with that on another show. It's not a level 5. It is not a custom build. A great example of a Restomod is if you take a Camaro and you pull the small block Chevy out and put a modern LS in it. If you take your Mustang, your classic Mustang, and put a Coyote engine in it. Or if you take your Challenger or Cuda and put a modern Hemi in it. Those are examples of a Restomod. If you are one of those guys that wants to put a Crown Vic front suspension under your old Ford truck, that's Restomod territory, where you're taking out the original twin I-beam suspension and you're putting something in out of a junkyard or either junkyard or aftermarket. Now, the reason this is more difficult than is level 2, which is a mechanical and cosmetic restoration, is because with the Restomod, when you start crossing things over, you're into hot rod territory. And that means you have to be able to solve problems. You can't just call up somebody and say, hey, you know, I'm trying to put this engine in. Can you help me out? Unless the guy's a hot rodder, he's gonna say, hey man, you're on your own. You have gone out of anything that's OEM. A lot of times you can talk to guys, aftermarket manufacturers, if they're building suspensions like Fat Man Fabrications. Brent's a good friend of mine. The guy really, really understands suspension. So a lot of times you can ask him, hey, here's what I'm doing, and he can pretty much give you an idea how to solve the problem, but he's not right there. So you have to be able to take what he tells you or what I tell you or whatever somebody else tells you and go, okay, is this going to work for me? Which means you have to have a little bit of fabrication skill, a little bit of design and engineering skill to help solve your problems. I mean, you can go to the aftermarket, like I said, and a lot of times they'll have brackets and things that can help you. You know, you're going to be on your own for some of this. You're going to have to deal with cooling systems because if you take an LS engine and drop it into your early Camaro, well, you can get it to bolt in. I mean, you can buy motor mounts from Holley or somebody like that, and you can get the motor to bolt in. Now you got to deal with the cooling system. You got to get your radiator right. You got to get your headers and your exhaust right. And a lot of times you can buy that in the aftermarket as well, but sometimes you can't. Especially if you're doing weird stuff, which a lot of us like to do weird stuff. You know, we want to take an AMC and put, you know, a Hemi in it or some crazy thing like that. That starts to get very advanced. So your skill level has got to match what your eyes want to do. You know, we say it in the industry all the time. A guy walks into a shop and he's got a filet mignon appetite with a hamburger budget. It doesn't work. You got to get on track with what you can do, and you got to get on track with what you can afford. Or you just get upside down on a project and everybody gets upset. That's not a good thing to do. So, like I said, you want to be able to solve problems. You got to be able to engineer parts to fit. You got to be able to make it happen. And you got to be realistic about what you're going to do. And this is the first time where you start to have a budget where you have to kind of keep hold of that, because a Restomod can run away with you real quick, because there are so many good stuff on the market. I mean, you guys calling in all the time, they're like, man, I want to put a blower on this, and I want to do that, I'm going to do all this, and it's like, dude, how much money do you have? You know, and if you've got the money, great, but you got to really, and you can't hide it from your wife long enough. Eventually, she's going to find it. You have to be realistic about it, and be realistic in what you can do. What kind of tools do you have? This is another thing. This is where, you know, the Restomod, you start pulling engines out and having to, you know, change and fabricate mounts. You got to be a welder. You got to have fabrication tools. You got to have engine hoists. You got to have floor jacks. You got to have the tools to do it, or you're at the mercy of somebody else. Now, let me tell you, if you're with a hot rod group, if you're with a club, awesome. If you're not, you need to get with one, because those guys can help you. If not, you're at the mercy of the local hot rod shop. And if you got a good one, that's great. But if not, there's some shops out there that you need to be careful of, because they don't know what they're doing. And so you really need to be careful. You can't rely on somebody else to build your project for you. You have to be able to do it yourself, or you will be taken advantage of. And part of the reason of learning how to do this stuff, even if you don't have the tools or the space to do it, is you can go to a shop and you can talk to the guy, the owner of the shop, and you can tell real quick if he knows what he's talking about. And if he doesn't know what he's talking about, you just go to another shop. You don't want to spend money there. So you might ask, okay, what's a good example of some Resto Mods that I've done here on the show? Well, the heavy metal tow truck is a prime example. You know, I pulled out the old International engine, dropped in a big Duramax diesel. Had to hand fabricate motor mounts, had to hand fabricate all kinds of stuff to make that thing fit. Not to mention suspension, the whole other deal. The catalog Camaro is a great example. Put a different clip in there, and we put an LS in instead of the small block Chevy. And then, of course, the V8 Interceptor, where we put the big John Cossey engine in the old 67 Cougar. There was a lot of surgery that had to happen there. That's obviously an extreme case, and of course the Interceptor, it's not just a Resto Mod, it goes on up to higher levels as well, which we'll deal with later on, like I said. Now, with me talking about keeping things on track and keeping things planned, the big question is, people are like, how do I do that? I mean, you talk about it, how do you do that? Well, for years, I used to do it like most people and keep it on numerous tablets and write things down and try to remember where you did stuff, and it's just ridiculous. Things get lost. And even if you keep track of it, when you sell the vehicle, the people don't know what's been done to it. So I wrote the project planning book. It's been out for several years. We sell it on the show. We sell it on Amazon Prime. You can get it right off of our website. I wrote this book to help not only for you to stay on track, but for you to actually write down, you know, what you plan on spending, your timeline, everything. And it is the best tool to keep you on track on the project and keep your budget where it's supposed to be. So check that out. If it's not for you, it's not for you, but believe me, I would strongly suggest it. The best part is, once the project is done, you sell the vehicle, you hand him the planning book, the guy can go through it and he goes, oh, this has bare brakes on it, and it's got Tremec transmission. Yeah, the guy knows exactly what's been done to it. He's got the part numbers. It becomes a service manual for that vehicle. Absolutely imperative, in my opinion. Okay, hopefully you have an idea what's involved in the Level 3 and the Resto Mod, but one thing I haven't talked about is the space that you need. With each one of these, a little more space is needed. And with a Resto Mod, you need at least 2 garage bays to be able to pull off a Resto Mod. You need one space to have the vehicle, and you need the other space to put your parts and to be able to work. You have to have at least that kind of space. If you don't have that kind of space, or if you don't have the tools to pull these things off, the welders and the things that I mentioned earlier, you don't need to be jumping into a Resto Mod. Even if you have the knowledge, you don't have the facility to do it. You don't want to be falling all over yourself to try to pull this kind of a project off. So if you don't have the space or the tools, don't step into it. All right, that takes care of number 3, the Resto Mod. We're going to take a break, then we're going to come back and we're going to answer some of your questions. You know, one of the big challenges that faces restorers out there today is finding good quality original parts. And there's a lot of places out there that carry custom parts, but finding those original parts can be very difficult. And that's one of the reasons you hear me talk about LMC Truck all the time. Because if you're doing a truck project, Ford, Chevy, Dodge, doesn't matter what year, they carry everything. They have got the parts, those little screws and those nuts and those little fasteners that you can't find anywhere, you can find at LMC. So if you have a project, even if you're not working on a truck, but you might need some hardware or something, you know, that is Ford, Chevy, or Dodge related, you need to have an LMC catalog, because I guarantee you, they got something that you can use. Okay, this question comes from Clay. Clay says, am I wasting my money putting aftermarket coils on my 6.4 Hemi? Well, Clay, that's a good question. Now, if you ask that question to your wife, she's going to say, yeah, you're wasting your money. But no, let me tell you, man, anytime that you can put an aftermarket product on there, it's almost always better than OEM. You know, I don't think it's a waste of money to put them on. It'd be a lot better if you put a supercharger on there too. But now you're going to have big time. Don't tell your wife I said that. You're going to get me in trouble, man. But no, aftermarket stuff I almost always recommend going over OEM. Okay, what we have here is a question from JR. JR has a Mustang, and he has got a question about a steering wheel. He says, I really enjoy the smaller steering wheels that I used on my older muscle cars, and I want to put a smaller steering wheel on my 2002 Mustang GT. He says he's got a 14-inch on there now, but he was told that he might not be able to go any smaller due to rack and pinion, steering setup, possible freeway steering issues, etc. Do you have any guidance you can help me with? Well, JR, yeah, I do have some suggestions for you. First of all, let's talk about it from a safety issue. I don't know what people have told you. It sounds from your email that people might have said that it'll affect your steering and that will be unsafe or whatever. It's not going to hurt your rack and pinion or your steering. It's not going to do that. What it does affect is your control of the car. Keep in mind, we're talking about ratios and we're talking about geometry here. So if you put a smaller steering wheel on, it's like putting a shorter handle on a ratchet. If you can visualize in your mind, if you took a ratchet and put it in the center of your steering wheel and brought the handle up, the longer the handle, the more leverage you have on that steering wheel, which means it's going to take less effort to turn a bigger steering wheel, and it's going to take less turns. The smaller the steering wheel gets, the more turns it's going to make and the more effort it's going to take to turn it. Now, you're just dropping down, you know, from a 14-inch to a 13-inch. That's okay. Those little tiny ones that you used to see in the 80s, you don't want to go with something little and tiny. It's like you have no steering control. But dropping down to a 13-inch, you'll be safe, but you will feel it probably in your control a little bit. Now, the biggest issue that you're going to find, see you're looking to put a Grant steering wheel on there, the biggest thing will be finding the adapter for your car and getting the steering wheel that you want for the adapter. You won't have any trouble going down to a 13-inch. It's not going to be unsafe, but you'll just have to get used to driving it. Sounds like you've done that before. If you had smaller steering wheels on big old muscle cars like Roadrunners and Chevelles, you'll be fine with a Mustang. All right, I've got a question here from David Montes. David says, hello, I have an 85 F-150 Lariat 5.0 fuel-injected truck. And my question is concerning vapor lock. Oh boy, here we go. He says, at first I thought my high-pressure fuel pump was too close to my exhaust manifold, so I relocated it, but my engine still continues to vapor lock. Is there a product I can use to insulate the fuel lines to and from the pressure regulator? He says, I'm able to drive the truck in the winter, but it's a no-go in the summer. Well, David, actually there is a product. DEI makes all kinds of products where you can wrap the fuel lines and they will keep the heat away from the lines. That's the simple answer. Now let's go into this a little bit. For those of you that are out there that don't know what vapor lock is, it's actually, think of when you boil water on the stove and water turns into steam. That's basically what happens in a very simple way with vapor lock. Your fuel starts to vaporize, and fuel vapor doesn't flow through the fuel lines, the fuel pump, and other components properly like liquid fuel does. Now, there's a few issues here, and there's a couple things with David's question that kind of make me raise an eyebrow a little bit. Generally, a fuel-injected vehicle doesn't have a problem with vapor lock. It was mostly an issue with carbureted vehicles. There's a couple reasons for that. Fuel-injected vehicles have a pressurized fuel system, which makes them less prone to vapor lock. And they usually have a fuel pump, electric fuel pump, that keeps fuel flowing, which cools the fuel down. So my question is, if you're having vapor lock with a fuel injection system, first of all, make sure it's truly vapor lock and you don't have a fuel pump that's going out or giving you trouble. Second of all, if you're having issues with a fuel injected vehicle, what kind of fuel are you using? Because some of these cheap fuels that are out have a lower boiling point, and that's an issue. Don't put cheap gas in that thing. Put the high octane fuel in there maybe try an octane booster. They all have a higher boiling point, and that will alleviate that problem. A little story I remember when I was a kid, we were going off to a Boy Scout camp one time. My dad taught the rifle range out there, and we were in the family station wagon, and we were out in Utah or someplace going across the hot desert, and the car starts sputtering. You know, I'm like a little kid. I didn't really know anything about cars, and Dad starts frantically pumping the gas pedal to keep the thing going. I said, well, what's the problem? He says, it's vapor locking, it's vapor locking. And I'm like, oh, this must be really bad. And my dad pumped that thing, you know, basically, I'm not even sure he knew what he was doing, but basically he kept the engine running on the accelerator pump that continued to pump fuel in there enough to where he could get up into the mountains. And of course things cooled down and then the engine started running again. But basically that's what was happening. So the biggest thing you have to do is try to get the heat down off of the fuel lines. So here's some ways to fight vapor lock. And for you guys with carbureted vehicles, this is something you really want to pay attention to. You can install some sort of a heat shield that shields your fuel lines. That's kind of an old school way of doing it. Like I said, the products that DEI carries is all about keeping temperature down. They've got wraps and stuff that you can wrap your fuel lines in, and it will keep that from ever being a problem. You can swap from a mechanical fuel pump to an electric fuel pump, put it back toward the tank. This will keep more fuel flowing through the lines, like I said before, keep them cooler. You can also put a bakelite spacer or some sort of a spacer under your carburetor to bring it up off the manifold a little bit. There's a lot of heat in that intake manifold. So any heat you can keep out of the carburetor, that keeps the fuel from boiling in the bowls of your carburetor. And then just make sure you're using good gas. This cheap stuff they got out there now is, you know, you need to be running 93 octane. Hopefully this will take care of it. Like I said, vapor lock used to be quite a problem with carbureted engines. With fuel injection, it's not that big a deal anymore, but it can raise its head once in a while. So hopefully, David, this helps you out. The rest of you guys, if you've got questions, especially concerning hot rods, hot rod parts, some sort of question you might have about fitting things together on a Resto Mod or something, man, that's what we're all about here. So send the questions in. We'll try to get you back out on the road. In the meantime, we're going to take a break. You know, you hear me talk about tools a lot, and there's a reason for that. Because we couldn't do what we do as car guys without tools. And we always need quality tools. And I always encourage people to find the best quality tool that you can. And for me, you know, after years of doing this, decades now, I haven't found anybody better than Cornwell Tools. And there's you know, they've been in business for 100 years. So obviously they know what they're doing. They continue to push forward in their tools and their boxes. They continue to push forward in new technology. I'm always eager to see what they come out with, and I will recommend them many times to you guys. There is a difference between buying something American and buying something that's an overseas imitation. And you guys that are car guys and tool guys, you know what I'm talking about. So check them out, Cornwell Tools. You won't be disappointed. Let me tell you a story about what I ran into on one of my first cars. When I was in high school, I had a 1930 Model-A Coupe that I bought. Of course, I had to have the American Graffiti car, so this car kind of looked like that. I got this thing, bought it for like $1,400, and I drug it home, and I didn't know much about cars. I was learning, and this car was a great learning ground for me. But almost everything that had been done to this car was wrong, and one of it was the frame. It had had a Z-notch put in it, which was a pretty cool deal. I didn't know what that was at the time. And somebody had actually done a pretty good job with that. But what they had forgotten to do is put any kind of cross members in. So when they put the motor and everything back down in the frame kind of rocked in. So it was twisted. So they quickly welded in a bunch of cross members and stuff to try to stop that from happening. And then it had a Ford engine in it. It, of course, had the oil filter that ran off to the side. And it had the long filter on it. So instead of going down and getting a short oil filter, they just cut a notch out of the frame. With a torch, they cut a notch out of the frame and then covered it with Bondo. Yeah, so there was a chunk out of the frame just on the top, which obviously didn't do anything for the integrity of the frame, but it was all twisted up and butchered up. And I had an old truck guy that he used to work on truck frames. He was a big rig guy, and he really knew his stuff when it came to frames and metal. And he came up and he pretty much schooled me on how to work with frames and how they bend and how to locate your welds and your joints and everything to where everything worked together, you know, about boxing frames and when you should and when you shouldn't. And I learned a lot. And I ended up, you know, getting rid of that car. It didn't kill me, but boy, it was unsafe, man. So this is why I warn you, when you go to buy something, especially if somebody has done any kind of suspension work, whether they have welded in a front cross member or a front suspension or a rear suspension or done a frame swap, you crawl under that thing and you look at their workmanship. If they have buggered up crappy welds, that probably means they don't know anything about suspension or frame geometry either. And that's a real warning. You don't want to get something that's out of whack or crooked. That will destroy a really fun project. So beware out there, guys. Keep your eyes open. Look out for the hack jobs. Keep in mind, this podcast is made possible by our friends at LMC Truck and our friends at Cornwell Tools. All right, that wraps it up for us today. It is time for you to get out there, start working on something, build something with your own two hands, send in your questions, send in your pictures, let us know what you're working on. All right, we'll see you later.